The fireball, the smoke, the debris plunging toward the ocean just east of the Cape Canaveral launch site. Now, for the critical moments of today's disaster, here is slow motion videotape just before the explosion. You can see the first explosion. Hard to tell whether it happens on the main liquid tank or in the solid rocket fuel boosters. Then the devastating wipeout explosion. Carry it a little bit forward because you can see one of the, in the upper right-hand part of your screen, we think you can see one of the solid rocket fuel boosters just sticking out and being blown away. There it is in the upper right-hand quadrant of your screen. One of the two solid rocket fuel boosters at this stage still at least partially intact, being blown away from that fireball. That a slow motion replay of the terrible moment this morning, just past 11:30 Eastern time, when the explosion occurred, destroying Space Shuttle Challenger. Now coming up on almost 2 hours since the explosion of the Space Shuttle, NASA still has made no official announcement on the fate of the 7 aboard the Challenger, though no survivors have been sighted. We've been showing you regularly throughout our coverage the live pictures provided by NASA of the scene where the debris, some debris has been sighted in the ocean east of Florida. It's just beyond this land where the debris is. It's very near the launch site itself out in the ocean because, after all, the explosion occurred only 1 minute and 12 seconds into the flight. Now, let us pause and review for you what we think we know as of this hour. Still no official announcement from NASA as to the fate of the crew of 6 and the school teacher passenger aboard the Space Shuttle. The Space Shuttle Challenger exploded into that gigantic fireball about 1 minute and 12 seconds after liftoff. Apparently, underscore that word, apparently all 7 members aboard the flight were killed. I emphasize again, as Bruce Hall has been doing, that there were no ejection seats aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. As Bruce pointed out, in the early space shuttles they had put ejection seats. That's when they had far fewer crew members. But two things quickly became apparent. First of all, those who rode the early shuttles apparently came back and said, listen, you're kidding yourself if you think anyone could survive with an ejection seat if anything goes wrong. And that's point number one. Point number two, as the number of people put aboard the space shuttles grew, it was determined we're only kidding ourselves by putting these ejection seats in, and there were no ejection seats aboard the shuttle this morning. Now, there's been no announcement on the fate of the crew after the explosion this morning, but it appeared there was no way they could survive. You look at the videotape and you say to yourself, how could anyone survive that? No American astronaut ever has been killed in flight. 3 were killed on the launch pad in 1967. The current NASA administrator, William R. Graham, was meeting with congressmen on Capitol Hill about the NASA budget when they saw the disaster on television. Steve Goldstein, who's an aide to Representative Manuel Lujan, who's a Republican of New Mexico, Steve Goldstein said, and I quote, NASA officials told the congressman it doesn't look like any lives were saved, unquote. The other crew members aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning, that is besides schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe of Concord, New Hampshire, were the commander, Francis R. Scobie, 46, the pilot, Michael J. Smith, aged 40, 36-year-old Judith Resnick, Ronald E. McNair, 35 years old, Ellison S. Onizuka, 39, and Gregory B. Jarvis, 41. Schoolteacher McAuliffe, well, they now have the names under the photographs. And let's pause for a second and ponder the faces of the 7 people who were aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning. The $1.2 billion spacecraft, one of 4 in NASA's shuttle fleet, was destroyed, completely obliterated. Parts of the ship fell into the Atlantic about 18 miles southeast of the launch pad. On a slow-motion video rerun of the explosion, as we've shown you, it was difficult to determine the exact source of the explosion. Bruce Hall passed along the theories put forward by veteran observers there. One theory was that the explosion began in one of the solid rocket fuel boosters attached to the side of the main fuel tank. Another of the theories put forward was that the explosion had happened, began very near where the solid rocket booster is attached to the main liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen fuel tank. Liquid hydrogen, keep in mind, is highly explosive. And there was one theory, after looking closely at the slow-motion videotape replay, that the early part of the explosion actually happened in the main fuel tank near where a seam is there. It was difficult to determine, to say the least, the exact source of the explosion, but unmistakably, when the huge fuel tank with nearly 500,000, 500,000 gallons of volatile propellant ruptured, it did tear the Challenger into many, many pieces. NASA said the fine pieces of debris continued to fall into the impact area for nearly 45 minutes. It took 45 minutes before all of the debris, or large portions of it, came down in extremely small pieces. Recovery boats and aircraft were dispatched to the area. They had to wait until the debris stopped raining before they could get into that ocean area to make a search. Paramedics leaped into the water in an effort. They parachuted down in an effort to find any trace of survivors. There is no word of any survivors. After the explosion, the two solid fuel rocket booster rockets did separate out and continued to fly crazily out of control in the clear sky. They were both trailing long trails of smoke before they plummeted into the water. One of those solid rocket boosters was seen floating down on its parachute. Recall, that's the way that if a launch goes well, both of the solid rocket boosters are supposed to fall away, fall down in the ocean by parachute, and be recovered and used again. The big tank, the main fuel tank, the one with the liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, those are not reusable. On previous launches, once the launch goes off well, that big tank drops away and somewhere over the Indian Ocean and is not recovered. Television pictures of the impact area relayed from a helicopter showed no evidence of any large pieces of debris floating in the water. Those are those shots from the helicopter that we've been showing you throughout our coverage. The launch had been delayed repeatedly, most recently because of fears that icicles on the launch pad could harm the shuttle. And as Bruce Hall reported from Cape Canaveral earlier, the launch was delayed about 2 hours this morning while they made an icicle check. That was because of the 28-degree temperature, very unusual for Florida this time of year, that prevailed overnight in Florida. Leslie Stahl, one of our White House correspondents, has been working at the White House this morning along with Bill Plant, our other veteran White House correspondent. Leslie, is there any late word about the president and what he knows?
Yes, Dan. First, let me tell you that there is an assumption here at the White House that nobody could have survived that explosion and that there are no survivors from what happened today. The president did come in and talk to a group of reporters who were having a briefing on the State of the Union, which the president says he will still go ahead and deliver tonight. He talked about the tragedy. He saw it on television. He saw a replay of it only moments after the explosion. He said he was more than saddened. It was a tremendous shock. He says he cannot get the teacher, Krista McCulloch, off his mind, although he did talk about the other brave people and their sacrifice. He talked about the families and how his heart goes out to all of them. He said this would definitely cast a pall over his State of the Union address tonight that was supposed to be very upbeat. He was going to be looking toward the future and, in fact, had written in a passage about Krista McCulloch and the future, the space shuttle program, the new frontier. He was asked by the reporters in the room what he would like to have people telling children who might have been especially interested in this flight because a teacher was aboard. And he said that he would like them to talk about Krista McCulloch and the others as pioneers who had sacrificed their life on the great frontier, and that just because of one tragedy, we cannot stop going forward. He was asked, what if a backlash develops over the space program because of this? And he said that he would be a voice opposing doing anything to stop the program because it is our new frontier and the only frontier we have. I can tell you, Dan, that there is real grief at the White House, as you can well imagine, as I'm sure there is all across the country, but a special grief because Krista McCulloch was here at the White House when she was named to be the teacher to go on this flight. I happened to have been in the room. She did not know till she got here that she'd been the chosen one, and the president made the announcement himself. He was the one who wanted to put citizens aboard. He was asked, well, do you think this should stop the idea of having citizens? And he said, well, everybody who goes up in these space rockets, spaceships, are citizens, and that the whole point of the program is to have citizens, and he does not want to see that stopped.
Thank you very much, Leslie Stahl. At the White House, the schoolteacher, Krista McAuliffe, was one of 2 women aboard the flight today. The other was astronaut Judy Resnick, who was, in fact, the second woman in space, the second woman behind Sally Ride. And we want to show you something about Judith Resnick in a moment. But just before doing that, we want to pause and underscore the following. We want to stress, as we've tried to do throughout the coverage, that we don't know, nobody knows, nobody has said, nobody can know at this early hour exactly what caused the explosion aboard the Challenger. And NASA has yet to say anything about it. That's something to keep in mind. Now, another thing to keep in mind, we've tried to explain to you as best we can how the launch went this morning, what the situation was, as we looked very carefully at that slow-motion videotape, and we've mentioned several times that it appears in the videotape that the explosion, the very first explosion, may have occurred in or around one of the solid rocket boosters.